All right, well, our next topic for today, I'm going to hang on because I'm going to do this presentation together with Saul Center, who you can also see on screen. Good morning, Saul. The next topic is to talk about the wayfinding mark in the system. And just so you know, Saul, we are scheduled to end this at 25 past the hour, so you can go ahead at our normal pace. I don't think we have to rush. I do want to make sure we have time. And if your microphone is on, yeah.
Oh, there we go.
Perfect.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Mike.
I'll turn it over to you, and I'll add some final comments when we get through most of this. I'm gonna turn my camera off too, so you don't have to watch you. Does that make sense?
Okay. Well, I'm glad to follow up on the previous presentation. I think this will be a nice segue. You know, I'll walk us through what we sort of set out to do here and what we saw as the challenges and imperatives, what our recommendations were at a strategic level, walk through visual exploration of wayfinding symbol to improve use cases for NFC overall, and then look at a few use cases and how the system unfolds there. So go to the next slide. Just at a high level, you know, our sense stepping into this project was that a primary challenge is that even though adoption of NFC and compelling use cases around it continues to have momentum, the use of the existing brand mark has been inconsistent at best, and at worst, you know, somewhat unclear and chaotic, and that's been a real hurdle for NFC to sort of realize its full potential out there in the world, and to really do what it could do in terms of improving users' overall wireless experiences across multiple consumer use cases. So what we've set out to do was to determine the best path forward on one level for the brand, but in particular, we were looking at the mark and how it signifies the presence of NFC in the world, and what we could do to improve upon that. Next slide, please. And so at a high level, the imperatives, as was demonstrated in the previous presentation, the NFC mark, anything we do on this front needs to really play a strong functional role in user experience and clarify substantially where consumers or where users should tap in order to activate the NFC experience. Next slide, please. That being said, there are a number of challenges to keep in mind here. Certainly the payment scenarios that we wanted to be very aware of that, and that you know, those are unique use cases, and there's an ecosystem or ecosystems, depending on what country, that are pretty well established, and systems marks that denote that payment interaction. So whatever we brought forward, we wanted to make sure was going to coexist with that and not conflict or confuse those particular scenarios. Next slide. We also wanted to, I think, make obviously wanted to be a contemporary mark that was ownable in the minds of consumers, so that we could continue to grow wireless mindshare as a brand out there that consumers associate with this type of interaction, and improve that overall awareness and sort of belief in the promise of what NFC interactions will deliver to them. Next slide. And as a function of all of that, of course, increase adherence, adoption, and consistency of usage among members, companies, and broadly adopters, so that the consistency of NFC in the world was enhanced and improved upon. Next slide. In many instances, of course, NFC is playing a sort of secondary role to a primary brand experience where adopters, whether it's the adopter's mobile phone, or it could be within a sort of fashion and garment context where there's a primary fashion brand, or any number of scenarios where there's what we would call a lead brand. And we wanted to be very aware that whatever solution we brought forward would be complementary and not compete with that lead brand. Next slide. One of the main concerns that that we were aware of stepping into this and brought to our attention, and certainly as brand professionals agreed with, that there was an issue out there with the NFC logo and the Nespresso logo. You might argue they're entirely, they're in entirely different spaces, but the fact of the matter is there is the potential for them to actually cross over in use cases. I don't know if Nespresso has yet adopted NFC technology for making a fine cup of cappuccino, but it's not outside the realm of possibilities. And certainly, in broader consumer experience world, we would agree that there was too much proximity to these marks and too much similarity to the sort of untrained graphic design eye. It would be quite it is quite confusing. Even though the NFC mark was first, and arguably, justice is not served by Nespresso being able to claim, sort of intellectual property over that mark. Nevertheless, I think the reach of Nespresso as a global brand sort of has made it the more dominant visual presence when it comes to this particular kind of icon. Next slide, please. So given all that, our recommendations, next slide, were to design a new NFC mark that builds upon the core brand strategy and brings it to life clearly and compellingly, including promise of simplicity and the power of use cases that it should meld with that kind of promise in the world there. Clearly denotes that tap here imperative, and can be deployed generically as a wayfinding symbol that complements lead brands. There, in the future, there could be an option where it gets deployed as a trademark for the NFC Forum. For now, we really see it as a wayfinding mark that allows people to address some of these challenges and hurdles with how users interact with NFC in the world. But it was designed in mind with a lot of flexibility to evolve into broader sort of NFC Forum corporate needs should the forum decide that. Next slide. So our focus is on wayfinding. And everyone's, I think, probably quite familiar with wayfinding devices in the world. We have a little quote here just to define what that is, but most of us experience wayfinding symbols on the road or at airports, and in our instance, we're seeking to help users identify precisely where the radio is, so that they can be assured when they bring their device in proximity to that, that NFC interaction will be triggered and unfold. Next slide. We are recommending that in addition to this, that the NFC Forum take a more aggressive stance in terms of disallowing and challenging any competing marks that use the NFC trade name for tap use cases. It's not, you know, there's a bit of a wild west out there on this front, so it may be a difficult battle to fight, but we believe it needs to be escalated, especially anything that is using that NFC name. You know, we hope that there is an organic adoption of, or we plan that there to be an organic adoption of the new mark because it's simply a superior wayfinding symbol. But in addition to that, to take this more aggressive stance when any instances of a mark that's using that trade name out there. And I think our sense is the reason why, I think on the next slide gives us a sense of what's out there. So next slide, please. Yeah. So these were just a few examples, but I think, you know, one of the reasons, or at least hypothesis as to why this has unfolded, is that there was an express need for there to be a clear wayfinding symbol out there in the world so that people could identify where to tap. And so since there hasn't been that clearly part of the system, that some of these marks have proliferated in an inconsistent manner. Next slide. And then as part of this, of course, and as we roll out the system, you know, what are the range of acceptable adoption scenarios? Again, we believe that the use of this new wayfinding mark obviously is going to be encouraged, and we will provide compelling reasons why as we deploy guidelines and the system. You know, in instances where people decide to not use a mark at all, which, you know, these days may occur on certainly on mobile phones is one place we see that. That will be allowed, but also, again, provide a compelling case for why this may be unwise and why this may continue to propagate less than ideal user interactions out there in the world. We will allow lead brand to develop their own wireless sub-brands, and we may provide some guidelines and templates, sort of recommendations around best practices. We will not, again, allow any alternate marks with the NFC trade name or N attached to it. Next slide. There's been, of course, many of you and many companies have adopted, invested in the adoption of the Generation 1 mark, the one that exists today. And so we want to obviously be aware of that and create some guidelines around recognition of that. So in-market products that are using the legacy mark, those will be recognized as allowed in perpetuity, but again, providing communication strategies and templates to help with transition at the pace at which the adopting company determines, and then keep a real eye on how it's going overall, who's adopting the new mark, who's not adopting it, and why, and is there anything that the forum can do to help us progress down that path of universal consistency. Next slide. As part of, I'll go through these a little bit quickly, but as part of the unfolding, this is some sort of broader brand thinking that we discussed with the group. We do think that as the broader brand strategy continues to evolve, that more zeroing in on core elements of the brand strategy beyond just the visual expression of it is recommended. So being very clear about these core components of brand strategy: enduring idea, differentiation, how it's primarily experienced, who it serves, and perhaps a kind of brand archetype as part of that overall system. We give some of the examples of this on the next page that are not not drawn from official brand guidelines by these companies. If you go to the next page, oh, sorry, this is just the framework for how we think about higher level brand strategy. But again, I think this is moving forward. This is something we would recommend, but doesn't directly relate to the mark that we'll be showing to you guys today. Next slide. And this is just how it plays out across a number of different companies in our minds. Next slide, please. So with all of that, visual explorations, we undertook quite a range of visual explorations and went through a number of rounds of feedback and revision with the core group at NFC Forum. If you go to the next slide, you'll get a sense of some of those explorations. So obviously many different ways to think about doing these. We went through exploration and then we went through a kind of grading exercise of which ones really function strongest as wayfinding mechanisms. That was, of course, a core criteria. We looked at other criteria like ownability and of course some of the other things we've mentioned about friendliness to the lead brands. And then as part of the process, we zeroed in on areas that we thought were most successful. If you go to the next slide. Yeah, these were a sub-selection of some of the ones that we began to zero in on as options and looking more closely at what was working about that for them and what was not working for them. Next slide. So with all that, we arrived at an approved symbol and system that we think really allows adopters to address this clarity of interaction and wayfinding need in the marketplace, while also providing a kind of clear bridge from the legacy symbol or the symbol that's out there in the world right now. And addresses some of the other primary issues that we identified going into it. Next slide. And we are providing a kind of system here. So the one in the center is really where this was the exploration arrived at, what we're calling the directional version of the symbol, which is a very strong wayfinding sort of denotation using sort of a targeting visual language, but also visually symbolizes a number of different things, including the antenna, including wireless waves, and of course a evolved version of the N symbol in the middle of it. But sort of going in a few different variations on that, we are allowing for a simplified mark over on the left, which may not be as clear for people who at first glance need strong wayfinding help. But for folks that have purchased a device and come to learn where the antenna is, and for brands that need a more simplified expression, we have the sort of simplified mark over on the left. In a charging scenario, we have a variation there as well. And then in kind of instructional, when we think even more instruction is needed, we are going to provide instructional variations that give people even more guidance as to how to interact with this NFC presence out there in the world. So if you go to the next slide. So this is kind of the evolved, going from what's available right there on the left from a wayfinding perspective to what's on the right for options for new, more stronger wayfinding denotation. across a variety of different use cases, some of which we'll show in a second. Next slide. And again, as we provide guidelines and talk about how these exist in the world, one way in which we might begin to talk about them is sort of one time. This is something you might be, encountering one time only, and it needs very strong guidance in terms of what you're expected to do. In the center, occasional usage where you continue to need to be given guidance on where to tap precisely, and then this everyday scenario over on the right. And then on the top, we provide the beginnings of some thinking about where various kinds of use cases might fall. So an operating system, that you're looking at many dozens of times a day in terms of what might appear in the menu at the top. We would expect the simplified mark would be quite acceptable there. Perhaps a car door also, again, something you're interacting with multiple times a day. But then, less frequent things, a hotel door, is quite a bit less frequent and may need more guidance. Disposable retail packaging, perhaps as well, in terms of how that gets implemented on shelf. So some examples there. Next slide. So again, we just began to look at a few use cases out there in the world to give a sense of what these mark options would begin to feel like and look like. Next slide. So here, as a kind of one-time offer on shelf, this might be a scenario where we might provide this sort of strong guidance for people to tap, and that might, in this instance, it might trigger a Prime membership experience. Next slide, please. Again, on consumer packaging, where people might begin to understand, certainly we plan and hope that they will over time, that what an NFC interaction would provide for them in a consumer packaging scenario like this, but want to continue to give strong visual reminders of precisely where they would tap in order to launch that product information experience. Next slide. Again, in a retail scenario, or fashion brand, we certainly wanted to look at how a strong brand presence like a Patagonia here would play with the wayfinding mark. So this is one example of how that might be implemented. Next slide, please. And in instances where the mark was adopted on back of mobile phone for existing use cases, also, potentially with charging, we felt that likely adoption of the simplified mark would be sufficient, but certainly for brands, for companies that felt like providing even more direction for their users was a plus. Using the stronger wayfinding mark would of course be an option. Next slide, please. And then here's that car door scenario where unlocking and it's multiple times a day interaction, continuing to remind people exactly where that is, but in a simplified manner. Next slide, please. And then here's that operating system example on the left. You can see it in relationship with Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, where we think it becomes a kind of sibling wireless brand, of course, and has a nice presence in relationship to those two marks. And then, how well does it work in the topmost menu? And you can see it there, over there on the right, to the left of the Bluetooth mark, and actually is quite a bit stronger than the Bluetooth mark at that particular size. Next slide, please. And then this hotel door unlocking, or it could be a home as well, although, in the home scenario where you're doing it every day, again, there could be an argument for using the simplified mark, but I think this is, for hotel guests who are already struggling with where their luggage is and whatever other kind of travel scenarios they have suffered through, a very clear, the clearest possible instructions on where to place their phone to unlock their door would probably be advised.
And real quickly, I think that's our last slide for you, Saul. Yeah, why don't we go back real quick? I do want to make one comment on this one slide here, and I haven't even talked to you in person since we were looking at this, but just as a final thought on the hotel door, we have that instructional mark that's got the phone tapping, on the mark. And when we originally did this slide, you may remember we actually had that mark there. But it occurred to me that a lot of hotels for the foreseeable future may still have IC cards. So like, little cards like you get today to get in. And that, of course, is not a phone. And so it would seem to me a better scenario for hotels would be to use this mark, simply because they might have a mixed use case of different devices. And by the way, also in the future, we could expect people being able to unlock the door even with their watch. So by having this multiple device classes that might interact, this might be a better mark for that particular use case, as an example. So anyway, so I'll take the next couple of slides, and so if you want to, you can turn off your camera if you don't want to stay online. But you can hang around if you want to also turn off audio. So real quickly, I'll make one last comment about this before I go into these final slides. So the mock-ups you've seen, these use cases, all of those are Photoshop examples of how the Tiger team that's been working on this would expect to see over time the marks being implemented. Next slide, please, Patty. All right, so let's talk about next steps. So what I want to convey to both our members as well as to those that are not members that are on at this open forum is that this will be a multi-year effort to launch, educate, and advocate for this new these new marks. The NFC mark has been in the market for well over a decade, of course, and I don't know if it's going to take us 10 years to get to the adoption we need. But this is not something we flip the switch and tomorrow this happens. It's going to be a multi-year effort. Today is the first public disclosure of the project and the completed work items. There's been a group of individuals that have been meeting actually for almost over a year to work on this, and Saul from Material Studios has led it from kind of a brand strategy point of view, a good partner in this work. But also countless hours by members of the organization to make this a reality. The idea is that we will establish a framework for success with some brand guidelines and the proper legal framework. I can actually report I'm happy to report today that the simplified mark, which is just the simple version of this new wayfinding mark, has already been filed for trademark registration in 3 domiciles already. We actually started that work last week in anticipation of the public disclosure today. But a brand guidelines document is forthcoming, likely within the next 60 to 90 days, hopefully 60, that will provide guidance of much of what you've seen already here today, but in a documented format. So let's see, begin education of current members and interested third parties. As we've talked about, as adoption begins, we'll support early adopters with some marketplace advocacy, and we will monitor the marketplace and iterate the plans as necessary. But it is a multi-year effort. Next slide. And as Saul already mentioned, there is strong adoption of the Generation 1 marks in the consumer electronics industry. That's for not just tap to connect, but also tap to transfer. We will continue, these marks will coexist for the foreseeable future, and that we will monitor the adoption of the wayfinding system and make any future determinations as it becomes appropriate. But for the time being, they will be coexisting in the marketplace. Next slide. All right, and that's the end of the wayfinding. Next slide after that, I think it's just cleanup for the session closing. Let's go on to that then.